All right, thanks for tuning in to the OFN meeting room as we talk New Orleans Saints football for the first time. And we haven't talked about the Saints since last year, so good to talk Saints football here with our special guest and our Saints analyst, Ross Jackson, who is host of the Locked On Saints podcast and the editor at Canal Street Chronicles at SBNation.com. Good to talk to you, Ross.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Greg. Thanks very much for having me. Very excited to talk about these Saints.
Yeah, tell me first, since you're on the network, first time, I always want to find out a little bit about our new guests, and hopefully this will be the first of many. So talk a little bit about your background first with the Saints.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm hosting the Locked On Saints podcast, which is through the Locked On Podcast Network. 5 episodes, 1 episode every day, Monday through Friday. So always coming with the newest information, talking a little bit about everything that you need to know about the New Orleans Saints. And of course, we cover across the network over 150 different shows covering all major sports as well, including also hockey and baseball and basketball. So we cover everything over there. But so I'm the focus over there for the Saints. I'm on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA, NOLA, of course. Originally born and raised in Louisiana, been a Saints fan all my life and been writing and covering the Saints for a couple of years now. Started a website a few years ago and then have just moved up from there, being able to be the host of this Locked On Saints podcast, as well as you mentioned, writing and editing over at Canal Street Chronicles, which is one of the largest Saints blogs there available. So very, very excited and pleased with what we get to do for a very talented 2020 roster coming up this season.
So talk about, first of all, you said 5 days a week. Is that all year, or is that during the season? All year.
All
so
year. No off season for me.
I know what that feels like. So tell me a little bit about what you talk about at this time of year.
Well, the fortunate thing is that I get to do it talking about the New Orleans Saints, who are never boring. There's always something going on. Either, Sean Payton's on Twitter cracking jokes, or there's some kind of wildness that's taking place. So it's always a lot of fun covering this team. And then, of course, it's a team that stays very active all year. I mean, they're consistently now rotating through that 90-man roster, adding players, waiving players as corresponding moves and everything like that. So they're a very active team, both in terms of what's on field and what's off the field. So it's a ton of fun being able to follow them. And at any time that there's a time to where, we can't talk about the Saints of today, always happy to talk about the Saints of tomorrow and look ahead to the future as well. Never too early to start looking ahead, never too late to start looking back. So I'm always happy to talk about this team with a very rich history and a very interesting history at that.
All right. So we'll have a lot to talk about once we get into training camp, because there is, of course, with the Saints ending their last 2 seasons the way that they did, very disappointing fashion, some controversy here and there. But the fact is, that's for training camp. Now we still want to talk about remnants from the draft, and this is still a good time to talk about it. Matter of fact, I have the Our Lads draft guide right here, so you can order the Our Lads draft guide. You can get a subscription at ourlads.com. 4 draft picks. That's it. Just 4 draft picks. But 7 draftable players were signed to rookie free agent deals. So that makes 11 players that are in this draft guide that have profiles on the players that the Saints are bringing into camp whenever camp starts. But let's talk about the first pick. And that's Cesar Ruiz, the center from Michigan, our lad's top-rated center. And Ruiz, a lot of experience with a big-time football team, Michigan. Didn't start his first year at center, played guard, but then his last 2 years at center. It's always good when you can land the top-rated center of a class when you're trying to make sure that you have a really good offensive line. What the Saints have done a good job of over the last 5 or 6 years of making sure that Drew Brees has his protection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a big time focus for the Saints to continue to improve at all times, that offensive line. It's a priority. Sean Payton is very much a believer. A lot of people will call him, a pass happy coach, which isn't wrong by any means. But I think a lot of people also tend to discount or a bit nullify his attention to detail when it comes to winning games in the trenches, which is a really big emphasis of his, something he really cares very much about. And so you can see that in selections over the last couple of years, like Eric McCoy to help replace the retired Max Unger, as well as now this year with Cesar Ruiz being the signing. It's it makes a lot of sense. I mean, when you look back at what gave the Saints some of the most trouble that they experienced in that 2019 season, including the wild card loss, interior pressure was a huge part of it, humongous part of it. And
Especially at Drew Brees' age.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so protecting Drew Brees at 41, 42 through he hopes to play through 55, I'm sure. But, protecting him through all of that is a big time priority for the Saints. And they've absolutely shown that. And this is another example of that, especially because they weren't very pleased with the play that they were getting out of their then right guard at the time of the draft, and Larry Warford, who's since been released. And so now you draft a guy that can plug in at center, and the guy that played center last year, Eric McCoy out of Texas A&M, who played fantastic there, has the ability to move over, take a little bit of a step to the right there, 3 feet to the right, and then he's your guy at right guard moving forward. That's pretty much the way that I expect it. So I love the pick, and I'm glad that the Saints continue to focus there and put an emphasis on that interior offensive line and the offensive line as a whole. But to be able to snag, as you mentioned, the top-rated center there was a huge get for them.
Absolutely. And then it wasn't until the third round, 74th pick. They had 2 picks in the third round, but Saints fans had to wait until pick 74 for Zach Bond, second-team All-American. But that's one of those situations where when you don't have that second-round pick and you're waiting and you want, look at all these really good players and they're going off the board and off the board. But then all of a sudden you're like, wow, we were able to snag Zach Bond with pick 74 when, who knows, maybe if we had a second-round pick, we would have taken him in the second round.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the Saints traded up to 74 to get him. They originally didn't pick until 88. And after the first day, a lot of Saints fans were disappointed in the selection of Cesar Ruiz because Patrick Queen out of LSU, the linebacker, was sitting right there, right for the pick. And
local
the
kid, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the Saints ended up not going for him. And so a lot of people were wondering, okay, when are the Saints going to take their first linebacker? And Sean Payton, at the end of day one, told the media in New Orleans that he was fairly certain that the top linebackers that are left are probably going to fly off the board pretty quickly. But fortunately for the Saints, the first linebacker in day 2 didn't fly off until 61, which was Willie Gay. And so they were actively trying to trade up and move up to get Zach Bond as quickly as they could, but had a lot of trouble moving up into the first round. And then eventually, finally, 45 minutes into trade talks with the Cleveland Browns, finally got to the points where they're able to move up to 74. It only cost them a third-round pick from next year, which they expect to have a compensatory pick in that same round coming to them since Teddy Bridgewater was signed with the Carolina Panthers. So not really a big loss for them, as they're still slated to select in every round next season as long as they get the compensatory picks that they're banking on. And they're able to get a guy like Zach Bond, who a lot of people saw as a late first rounder, early second rounder, early day 2 guy at 74, which is a fantastic get for them.
Yeah, talk about where you see him fitting in, because he was primarily an edge rusher, like Arled's kind of profiles him as a traditional outside linebacker in a 3-4 defense, but that's not what the Saints run. So, but still, he's an edge rusher. He's got to work on his coverage ability if he wants to be a full-time linebacker, but pass rushing is so important in the league. You can find one as late as the third round. That's late to find a talented pass rusher like Bond. Saints have got to be happy. So is that going to be his primary role early on?
It's an interesting thing, actually, because, a lot of people, including myself, looked at Zach Bond as an edge rusher, but at 237 pounds, he's just a bit undersized. Now, of course, he'll bulk up now that he has access to, professional level training facilities and professional level conditioning and things like that. Of course, he'll put on some weight, but there was some concern with his size. But the Saints are actually a little bit more interested in him, especially now Michael Hodges, who's the new linebacker coach there. He was assistant linebacker coach to Mike Nolan last year. Now Mike Nolan, of course, is defensive coordinator in Dallas. And Hodges is really interested in seeing how they can make Zach Bond work as a Sam or as a Mike linebacker. So they're looking at moving him to that 4-3 off-ball linebacker role because they did like what they saw with him in coverage.
Really?
A little bit. Yeah. The little bit that he did at Wisconsin. He didn't do a ton.
Sure.
And as you observed, he was mostly an edge rusher. He was a 3-4 outside linebacker edge rusher, coming out of the 2-point stance and trying to get after the quarterback. But they like what they saw from him in coverage. They like what they saw from him at the Senior Bowl, getting work in coverage as well. He and I believe it was Josh Uche, maybe. I believe it was the two of them that really stood out as guys that were coming in to the Senior Bowl as pass rushing linebackers that actually impressed in coverage a bit during practices. The Saints love their Senior Bowl guys. Zach Bond's another one on a long list of Senior Bowl participants that the Saints have drafted over the last few years in the Sean Payton era. And so they're very interested in shifting him to that 4-3 off-ball linebacker. Perhaps he starts off at Sam until he gets a little bit more comfortable with the defense, because once he shifts to Mike, then he ends up getting, way more responsibility in terms of calling plays, being a 3-down guy, or calling shots and being a 3-down guy. And so maybe you see him start off at Sam and then eventually transition to that Mike role that Hodges wants to put him in. But that's where they're looking to try him out in his first season.
And where does that put Demario Davis?
Demario Davis will probably stay at will.
Okay.
That's where he's been playing. And so Alex Anzalone's been the guy that's at that Mike position and calling a lot of shots, and they like him a lot. But of course, he has a long injury history, laundry list of it since his days in Florida. And so I could see him moving to Sam potentially, which would be effective because it would extend his availability, because he's not on the field 3 downs. On 3rd downs, and so that extends a little bit, makes him a little bit more available. But we'll see exactly where he fits in at the beginning versus where he ends up in the year, because later on in the year, because I expect there to be a change.
Well, and I mentioned that with Davis, and it's interesting because we just talked about how, okay, here's Bond, who's projected to be a 3-4 outside linebacker, edge rusher type player. Now he's going to a 4-3 defense. The coaching staff picks him, wants to put him in a spot that they believe, from what they've seen on film or up in person at the Senior Bowl, this can work on their defense. And I mentioned Davis because when Davis was coming up, he was more of an inside linebacker, run stuffer type guy. And his final year with the Jets, which is my team, he started to come on, but he never took off until he made the switch to New Orleans, and they started using him more on the outside. It just shows you how your career can change with different schemes and with different coaching staffs.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Saints love guys that are multiple. They love guys that can be somebody that they could sub into a NASCAR package like Zach Bond and get him involved in pass rushing. They love guys that, like Demario Davis, who can play Will, Mike, and Sam. He can be a run stuffer. He can call the shots, and he can, excel in coverage, which is something they've really, really loved about him. They love those multiple guys, and Zach Bond just checks that box again.
Okay, now the second pick in the 3rd round was tight end Adam Troutman from Dayton. I believe he was our lad's 2nd-rated tight end. You got a big smile on your face for Troutman.
Yeah,
but,
it's such a story.
Yeah, okay. You take a look at everything about this kid, and you get the feeling that if he can, which you believe he will, get stronger, and I think that's the thing. He's coming from a smaller school. FCS level, so he's going to have to get bigger. That's the one thing that's kind of the knock, is whether he can hold up, blocking, making sure he doesn't get pushed off his routes too easily. If he can do that and still maintain his athleticism, he's got like a really good basketball type of movement to him, coordination, should be a matchup nightmare in certain circumstances, as our lads put it. There's a lot to like there.
Yeah, he's got a lot of athleticism, and he's got great size, and he certainly, at 6'5", I believe.
Yes.
He has the frame to put on a little bit of extra weight. They don't need to get him up to 270, 280. They'd probably just want to get him in that 260, mid 260 range, kind of where Jimmy Graham might have been, for instance. However, actually utilizing him as a blocker, unlike what Jimmy Graham did while he was in New Orleans. But Adam Troutman, somebody that's very exciting. The Saints clearly believe in him, because the reason why I had the big smile on my face is because they traded away their entire day 3 stash in order to move up and select him at the end of day 2. For a while there, until pick 240, that was a 3-person draft class, and that's what the Saints were perfectly happy to walk away with, and especially getting a guy like Adam Troutman, who, according to Jeff Ireland, who's the head of scouting for them, he's somebody that they believe can have an immediate impact. And so we'll see how quickly he finds his way onto the field, and whose snaps he takes away, because you've got guys like Jared Cook and Josh Hill who have been staples for this offense. Jared Cook starting last year, and Josh Hill for many years over the last, probably, I don't remember how long he's been around, but he just signed a recent extension and everything. They really like him. So it'll be interesting to see exactly where Adam Troutman does come in and become a part of that, a part of that offense.
Well, and I'm sure Peyton he's trying to find his next Jimmy Graham.
Oh, absolutely.
And even though, like you said, Cook did a good job last year, he's already at a certain point of his career that, okay, maybe he's going to peak for the next couple of years, but Troutman's got a whole career ahead of him. And
Exactly.
look, Breeze ain't going to be around forever, but still, Peyton loves to have one of those matchup tight ends that can cause havoc, and he hasn't had that since Graham.
That's exactly right. This is exactly what they're hoping to get from him. I mean, you have to look at the fact that up until last year, I mean, they drafted Alize Mack out of Notre Dame in the 7th round, but opposite that, the last tight end that they've drafted was Jimmy Graham, and they don't really draft tight ends at all. So they took one in the 7th round. They took Jimmy Graham and Adam Troutman, now nearly over 10 years apart, in the 3rd round. So it makes a lot of sense that for the Saints, or I guess right at 10 years apart, but makes a lot of sense that for the Saints, that's what they're hoping that he'll be able to do, and what he'll be able to turn into is exactly that model and mold that they had in Jimmy.
Okay, and then their final pick went to Tommy Stevens, the quarterback from Mississippi State. I don't know what this pick's about myself. Sometimes 7th rounders, you might be able to find one that helps you out. Normally they're practice squad guys. That's what that's the best you're going to get out of Tommy Stevens. But I don't know. I wasn't never really. I didn't look at Tommy Stevens on Saturdays and think that he was going to amount to much in the NFL. But I don't know. There's something they liked about him.
Well, remember how I said that it's fun covering the team because there's always something wild going on, and Sean Payton loves to do things over the offseason?
Yes.
Tommy Stevens is absolutely that example.
Okay.
Tommy Stevens was originally in conversation with the Saints to be an undrafted free agent.
Okay.
And that's what the Saints really focused on the 3rd day. They traded out to grab Adam Troutman, gave up all their day 3 picks, said, fine, not even worried about it. We'll focus on undrafted free agency. It's a very important part of the Saints offseason, undrafted free agency. They were in the conversation with Tommy Stevens. Tommy Stevens was also in conversation with a little team, the Carolina Panthers, within the same division with, of course, offensive coordinator Joe Brady. Offensive coordinator Joe Brady spent time with Penn State and developed what eventually became that Taysom Hill role, actually, with the New Orleans Saints, with Tommy Stevens in Penn State. So this sort of multiple guy that can be an offensive weapon, the Swiss Army knife thing. Okay. Tommy Stevens was that at Penn State. Didn't do that when he went to Mississippi State, and a big part of that had to do with the fact that they didn't have that type of a game plan implemented like Penn State did with Joe Brady. Joe Brady then goes to New Orleans. Taysom Hill becomes a thing. Joe Brady goes away, takes a year, just helps to put together the greatest college offense we've ever seen. Yeah. That's all.
And then he goes and then he tries to become a coach. He is now a coach in your own division.
Exactly right. So now he's there, and the Saints and the Panthers are both in conversation with Tommy Stevens, and eventually Tommy Stevens' agent stopped returning the Saints' phone calls. Oh. So Sean Payton trades, or I guess I should say the Saints organization trades a 6th-round draft pick from next year, which again, they're expected to get a compensatory pick for the 6th round because A.J. Klein left to go to Buffalo to reunite with Sean McDermott, who used to be in Carolina. And so the Saints trade that 6th-round draft pick and then draft Tommy Stevens at 240. So then Sean Payton sends a text to Joe Brady that says basically, not so fast.
Up yours.
And then, yeah, exactly. And then sends another text to the agent of Tommy Stevens saying, I'm done asking. I'm making this happen.
You're not going to answer my call? Well, screw you, pal. I'll draft your kid.
Exactly right. So he went and got the guy that he wanted, and the intent is very much to use him in a Taysom Hill-like role, which makes a lot of sense if you look at what when you look at what it is that they're hoping to do with Taysom Hill, whether that means that he becomes the future quarterback in New Orleans after Drew Brees. You have a guy like Tommy Stevens that can operate in the same role that Taysom Hill
in case something happens to Hill.
Exactly.
That's important.
And then
yes.
And then if Taysom Hill ends up not being the guy in New Orleans and he signs elsewhere, as the Saints would anticipate that he would in that case, you have a guy like Tommy Stevens who's 6'5" and can do all the things that Taysom Hill, and they believe could potentially do all the things that Taysom Hill can do in that role. So that's really the fit for him.
So
we'll see if he makes the roster.
By the way,
that's the idea.
So that guarantees that Tommy Stevens will make the 52-man roster.
It could.
There's no way they're going to expose him to the practice squad so Carolina can come in and get him.
That is one school of thought. The other school of thought that I'm also very aware of is that Sean Payton is petty enough to draft a guy that they wanted to get as an undrafted free agent away from another team, and then let him walk. And then the Carolina Panthers would obviously take him off of waivers, but wouldn't have a full offseason to implement his game plan in that case. We've seen Sean Payton do things.
Okay.
We've seen it. But I would love to see him make the roster. It just depends on where, they want to use him in a special teams role in particular. So it depends on where you take from elsewhere
Sure.
on the roster to carry 4 quarterbacks on your team.
And it's interesting too, because it's really rare. I mean, I haven't seen the data, but it's rare when you think your draft is over and you're in the 7th round and somebody calls you up. Let's say you're somebody writing for the team. I don't know what your status was in the 7th round, maybe going, okay, I'm done. And then somebody calls you and says, well, the Saints aren't done. They've traded back into the 7th round from 2021 draft. That just doesn't happen.
Well, that's the big thing, is that, actually many of us expected it. And it's not that we had any whispers of it happening. We just know how Sean Payton is. We know how Mickey Loomis is. We know how Jeff Ireland, we know how those guys are.
Right.
And none of us really believed that the Saints were actually going to go through an entire 4 rounds in day 3 and not do something.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. Now, you were talking about the free agents, and the free agents are important because when we take a look at, as I said, there are 7 free agents. I got a little glare in my green screen. 7 free agents, and that were gradable players. Let's start with wide receiver. Let's start with Jajuan Johnson, because Johnson, it's interesting. You take a look at Troutman. Troutman's got the size factor going, and so does Johnson. Johnson's got the size factor going. He's also, I mean, this was a 4th round graded draft player, Jajuan Johnson.
Right.
So to get him outside the draft was a big coup for the team. And you got a guy that some people believe could move in to a tight end role because he's so big, and he's also a very good blocker. He's somebody that can hold it. So he's already a better blocker than Troutman. And I mean, tall, long, thick, huge hands. He's made big time catches for a couple of big time programs. There's a lot of inconsistencies there, though, which is the reason why he wasn't drafted. But to get him outside the draft, that was a pretty good deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's an interesting guy for the team. The Saints used to have an undrafted free agent on their team named Brandon Coleman, who was a 6'6" wide receiver
from Rutgers.
Yep.
My team.
Oh, the good Scarlet Knights, man. We love it.
New Jersey.
Mike Burton's on the team now as well. And so, I have a nice little rapport with Rutgers for certain. But, they loved him. They loved what he was able to do as a blocker. And I think Jajuan Johnson is somebody that if he stays at his natural position of wide receiver, or his collegiate position of wide receiver, that could fill a similar role to what Brandon Coleman did. And Brandon Coleman was huge for the Saints in, the run game. He was a guy that he had a little bit of struggles and kind of the same inconsistencies that you mentioned in Jajuan Johnson, in that he's a big guy, but sometimes didn't play big enough. Jajuan Johnson's coming in with a 33% contested catch rate from his 2019 season, but also dealt with injuries and things like that. So there's a lot of context to that. But it is an interesting thing to see exactly how Jajuan Johnson could potentially fit in with the Saints, as there is a mold that could potentially be available for him. The Saints looked to fill that role last year with guys like Lil Jordan Humphrey and Krishawn Hogan. Now you've got both of them on the roster, along with Jajuan Johnson, and even a guy like Maurice Harris, who's an NFL vet, that could fill that role as well.
All right. And then the other player, another wide receiver, who's Marques Calloway from Tennessee. I got to imagine that the only way he makes the team is he's got to make the team as a punt returner / kick returner. If he doesn't make the team on special teams, I don't think he has a chance.
Yeah, it makes it a little tough for him, but it also makes it tough for him to make the roster in those settings of kick returner and punt returner, because they have an undrafted free agent from last year, Deontay Harris, who was an All-Pro kick returner. So
that's true.
So it makes it really tough for him to sort of find his way onto the roster. But he would have to kind of go the same route that, let's say, Emmanuel Butler started in last year's training camp, standing out, but then find a way to be more inconsistent and stay healthy. Emmanuel Butler was somebody that really stood out in training camp last year for the Saints, but unfortunately couldn't keep the momentum going, dealt with a couple of injuries, and then wasn't really the same under the lights after that when it finally got to the preseason. So if Marques Calloway can be somebody that ends up being, a good deep threat for the team, even though the Saints don't usually like to go deep, but Drew Brees was still in the top 10 in passes that went air yards plus 19 yards last year. So it's still, a part of their offense and an element of their offense. They lost Ted Ginn Jr. So if you're looking for vertical guys, while you have the more shifty route runner, short to intermediate guys like Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders, that might be where he finds his role, but it's certainly a long road for him to get there.
Okay, now let's talk about the 2 offensive linemen who they're intriguing, even though we're not type of gradable players like Jajuan Johnson. They're still very experienced, both from the Pac-12, Throckmorton and Paulo. Paulo was a first team last year. Throckmorton was a 4-time all Pac-12 performer. You can't do better than that. Started every game over 4 years, Throckmorton did. Now, he's not a special guy. He doesn't do any one particular thing great, but he's extremely reliable, a smart player, competitor. Those guys can be around for a while on the offensive line. And Paulo, I don't like as much as Throckmorton, but still, I think, when you're talking about a tackle compared to Throckmorton being a guard, even though Throckmorton's played just about every position on the offensive line, will be better suited inside. Paulo's a guy with long arms. He's physical. And again, he's played against the best in the Pac-12, and he's performed pretty well. So a couple of very interesting offensive line rookie free agents.
Yeah, Paulo, I think, is somebody that has a real shot as a practice squad guy that could end up getting called up over the season at some point if they need the extra bodies on the offensive line. That's a big thing for the Saints, is that the practice squad doesn't mean that you're not seeing the field. The practice squad means you just need to wait a little bit longer, and then you might end up seeing the field.
Sure.
They'll go to the practice squad first before they go to outside free agents if they need an emergency addition or anything like that. And Paulo is somebody that I think could find his role there and replace maybe a guy like Derek Kelly, who was on the practice squad for the Saints last year, because Derek Kelly's not multiple, right? Darren Paulo is somebody that's played both guard and tackle, but is built like a tackle, which makes it a little bit easier for him to step inside, or makes it a little bit more intriguing should they need him to step inside. Now, Throckmorton is somebody that I like, and I actually see has a position and has the potential to make the 53-man roster and start day one, not start day one, but start the game day one on the roster.
Yes.
And I think that that's something that has everything to do with his versatility. As you mentioned, he's played every position on the offensive line, I think, except for left guard, but he actually might have played that his freshman year, now that I think about it. So he's played all over that offensive line and is a fantastic addition to this team. He's somebody that's going to be better suited inside, yes, but if you need somebody to be a sixth man, kind of like the Senio Calamete mold that the Saints created a few years ago for a swing tackle, they could potentially find that in Calvin Throckmorton.
Okay, now the final three guys I wanted to talk about are all on defense. You got Bocci, the linebacker from Michigan State. You got Malcolm Roach, defensive tackle from Texas, and Keith Washington, the corner from West Virginia. Now, Bocci is the intriguing guy because he was so good for one of the top defenses in college football over the last few years until the 5-game suspension that ended his career, the PED suspension. Look, he's not a cover guy, but if you're looking for a pure throwback, 2-down, run-thumping Mike, there's your guy.
Yeah, absolutely. He's somebody that I like a lot. He's somebody that I could see making this roster as well. He's one of the other guys. And I just want to clarify for people that are watching that aren't familiar with the Saints keep 2 or 3 undrafted free agents. They make the roster every year. The Saints and the Chargers are kind of quality undrafted free agent destinations among a couple others in the league. And so it's not out of the ordinary in the world of the New Orleans Saints. Talk about undrafted free agents making the roster and talk about more than just one. And Joe Bocci is somebody that has, kind of like Calvin Throckmorton, a pretty direct route to the roster because Kiko Alonso, tore an ACL in December last year and late in the season, or actually no, it was in the playoffs in that wild card game. And so it's not a certain thing that he'll be back at the beginning of next season. He might start off on that PUP list. And so that would give them 6 games before they would have to activate him before he goes to injured reserve if he goes reserve PUP. And that opens up another spot along with the spot that A.J. Klein vacated, which would probably be filled by Zach Bond. You've got Caden Ellis, you've got Craig Robertson, and then that 6th linebacker, as the Saints usually like to keep 6, it could be Joe Bocci because he's a tackling machine and he's somebody that could slide in on 2 downs as a Sam linebacker if you need that, or as a Mike linebacker if you need that for any reason, and whether it be injury or rest related, or they have a huge lead, or they might be down huge, whatever the conditions might be. Although the last one feels a little unlikely, but when it comes to this team, he's somebody that could fit in. He would, if it wouldn't have been for the PED suspension, over 100 tackles all 3 seasons. I think he finished with 72, 75 just before he was suspended in 2019. So he very likely would have, with those 5 games left, gone over 100 tackles. He's a fantastic guy for that. He's a fantastic run stopper, and the Saints very much appreciate that as one of the top run defending teams in the league.
Any chance Roach Washington makes the practice squad?
I could see both of them making the practice squad. Keith Washington is somebody that's really, really interesting because he's got incredible speed and size as well. He's got really, really good size, pro size. He's somebody that could make it as somebody that they look at for cornerback depth, but also just as another special teamer to have on the roster. They brought back Johnson Batamosi, who played a good portion of last season, but unfortunately ended up injured. So they know they have some injuries with that team. They also double up a lot of linebackers and secondary players on special teams like Patrick Robinson, who was also dealing with injuries. So you could see a guy like Keith Washington sneak onto that practice squad roster and at some point to the roster if they need him or if they need to call him up, because that speed is invaluable, say in kick coverage and punt coverage and things like that. So you could definitely see him making the role, filling the role of a special teamer. And then Malcolm Roach, unfortunately, I like Malcolm Roach a lot, but unfortunately it's a very busy defensive line in New Orleans. I mean, I think they're holding 9 different just defensive ends on the roster right now, including a guy like Margus Hunt, who plays both interior and exterior, or interior and outside, just like Mario Edwards, and just like what Malcolm Roach would do as well. So he's somebody that I like a lot, and somebody that former St. Delvin Bro told me to watch out for. And so, that's something, right?
Sure.
When you have that guy out there willing to say that. But it'll be interesting to see if he really gets a shot, just because of how crowded that defensive line is. They have a lot of defensive ends. They have a lot of defensive tackles, so they have dealt with injuries at both positions. So he'll definitely be somebody to watch over this offseason.
Okay, and in all, how do you think the team did as far as the draft, or just as far as adding these 11 new players to the team that we talked about, and what was the fan reaction?
Yeah, I mean, the fan reaction after things started to clarify a little bit more with the Cesar Ruiz pick, the fan reaction turned to be overly positive and very positive. And of course, this is everybody, all these guys are going to be all pros. All these guys are going to be Pro Bowlers.
Of course.
It's that part of the
Well, sometimes though, the fans can get, especially if you're in a big metropolitan area, they can be pretty tough. So
yeah, and you definitely saw that for a little while during this draft with Cesar Ruiz, but once things became a little bit more clear with Larry Warford, things kind of settled down a little bit, and people had a greater understanding. But people love the undrafted free agent class, as the Saints, they love their undrafted free agents, and it's a big part of their draft. And the Tommy Stevens trade up was just something that Saints fans now, it's a story that they get to tell. And so I feel really good about this draft class. I knew, but we had a good feeling that this would end up turning into a quality over quantity type of approach for the Saints in the draft, the actual 3-day draft itself, because there's just not a lot of holes on this roster, and there's not a lot of time either with a truncated and kind of unprecedented offseason ahead. So they went for guys that are very smart, high football IQ, guys that can play multiple roles, and guys that fit exactly what they need and the mold that they look for on their team. And you can see that it's clearly evident in the first 3 players that they selected for certain. And, bringing those guys in, and that's kind of the through line between all of them, is that they're guys that can learn a playbook on their own, show up the first day of training camp in July because the Saints had canceled off-season activities, and they're just going to get started with training camp come July, and they should be able to step in and be able to fit right in. And they look for the same thing when it comes to Calvin Throckmorton is somebody that's always his nickname is Doc Throck. Like his whole persona is being that smart guy. He was called in on Tuesday of Senior Bowl practice and knew the playbook by Thursday when he stepped on the field. So pretty incredible what he's able to do and how smart he is, and that's really what the Saints look for in this draft. And I think they achieved exactly what it was that they were looking for.
Well, I know I'm going to have a really good time talking to you when training camp comes around, because there's so much unfinished business to talk about from last season, or even the last couple of seasons. And that includes Drew Brees and the whole quarterback situation. And I just think there's a lot of interesting things that, and especially coming from somebody that knows the area so well, and as you said, knows how fun and exciting and interesting it is to follow this organization, thanks to Sean Payton and the way things, whether it's the draft, the offseason, the regular season, no matter what it is. So I think we'll have I know I'm going to have a very interesting time catching up with you once we find out when training camp begins.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to it. Look, we just did a long segment here, and we never even mentioned Jameis Winston's name once. So there's so much left to talk about when it comes to these New Orleans Saints, because they stay busy over this offseason. So I'm looking forward to it, Greg, and I appreciate it very much.
And I'm going to make sure that when we do this again, that you can't see me right now, but I chose this shirt. And I had this shirt. It's a colorful blue shirt, and I have like a section in my closet that has like my on-air shirts and my off-air shirts, because my off-air shirts, they don't go well with the lighting and the green screen. so I can't wear them. But for whatever reason, the shirt that I'm wearing now was in the on-air shirt category, and I hadn't taken it for weeks. And I kept saying, all right, well, why didn't I take this? It must be, what's it doing in this corner of my closet? There's got to be a reason. So I grabbed it. I sat in front of the screen before we went on the air. Everything looked fine. I go, oh, this is nice. I'll wear this shirt. Well, apparently, once the sun went down or the clouds involved with my window, all of a sudden, because the shirt's blue, my forehead started lighting up blue. So I was like, well, this is the reason why I wasn't completely, I knew there was some reason I wasn't grabbing that shirt. So now I know it's going to go in the other category. I'm never going to wear it again on the air. So I won't be bouncing around trying to look for perfect angles. So my head ain't blue. But great job, Ross. And it's great to hear that you talk about the team as often as you do. And again, like I said, I'm looking forward to talking to you again when the season, or at least before training camp begins. And then we should have a fun season as the Saints try to march on for a second Super Bowl title.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited to be here. I appreciate you having me. Looking forward to all these conversations that we have to go through because, as you mentioned, this should be a very entertaining one and a very fun one to discuss. So I'm very much looking forward to it, Greg. I appreciate it.
Take care, Ross.
You as well.